Good evening, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Cutler. It's good to be with you tonight. I just got in from mowing my lawn, so it's kind of nice to be able to relax a little bit and do some read aloud. And it's the weekend, so I'm excited about that too. Tonight we're doing read aloud. It's Among the Imposters, and we're on chapter 14. And chapter 14 is kind of a short chapter, and so is 15. So I'm going to do both chapters tonight. All right, here we go, chapter 14. By the end of the week, Luke had a nice plot of land cleared. The raspberry plants were at the center, and he had straight lines of bean sprouts planted on either side. It was Dad he pretended to appeal to the most. "What do these look like to you, Dad?" he'd say aloud, as though Dad were really there to answer. "Am I just wasting my time, or will I have a good crop come fall?" Luke truly wasn't sure, but he felt so proud looking at that neat little garden. He kept meaning to explore more of the woods, but he was always too busy digging and weeding and tending his plot. Anxiously, he shooed away squirrels and chipmunks, and he wished that he could stay out and guard his garden all the time. But each afternoon, he kept a close eye on the barren watch he wore on his wrist, so he could run back to school promptly at 6 o'clock. He found the watch in his suitcase and faced quite a chore figuring out how to read it. Those lines with the V's and the X's on it were numbers he knew, but different from what he was used to. Why did barons always have to make everything so fancy and complicated? Back home, Mother and Dad just had a single digital clock in the kitchen. It blinked off the minutes as clear as could be. The watch was like a foreign language to Luke, but he stared at the angles of the rays of the sun, and he studied the digital clock at school, and he compared them with the watch on his wrist. Eventually, he understood the Baron watch as well as any other. That made him feel proud too. So did his next accomplishment. One day at lunch, they served baked potatoes in the school dining hall. They were so undercooked they practically crunched. Luke bit into a raw end that hadn't even had its eye removed. Spitting it out, he complained to himself, "I'd rather plant this than eat it." Plant this? Of course! How many springs had Luke spent cutting up potatoes for planting? He and Mother perched over a 3-gallon bucket, knives flashing. When he was little, he'd always tried to rest his feet on the top of the bucket, the same way that Mother did, but he was never tall enough. Even when he was tall enough, he never balanced things quite right. He'd tip the whole bucket over. Mother would look at him sternly and sigh, "Oh, pick it up." But then she'd smile like she wasn't really mad. She talked to him the whole time they worked. "Careful with the knife. Don't cut toward your hand. You're making sure there's an eye in every potato, aren't you? Nothing will grow without an eye, but potatoes would grow without a seed. He just needed a raw potato." Covertly, Luke used his fork to separate the cooked and the raw part of the potato. The raw part he dropped into his hand and he slipped into his pocket. Probably nobody had ever used Baron pants for transporting potato parts before, but Luke didn't care. So, as soon as the bell rang for the end of lunch, Luke moved quickly among the tables, grabbing the left-behind potato pieces wherever he could. His pockets were stuffed in a matter of minutes. He walked swiftly down the hall and out the door, trying not to smash the potatoes. Nobody noticed. Out in the woods, Luke dumped out his pockets, and he examined his treasure. He had 8 potato pieces that looked like good candidates for planting. He wished he'd thought to smuggle a knife out of the dining hall, too, but that couldn't be helped. He halved as many of the potatoes as he could using his fingernails and brute force. Then he planted them in a row beside the beans. When he was done, Luke sat back against a tree trunk and surveyed his work. It looked good. In a few days, he'd know if anything was going to grow. He thought the bean sprouts looked bigger. At least, they weren't withering yet. After a few minutes of rest, Luke walked down to a creek that ran through the woods, and he cupped his hands in it, making trip after trip to bring back water for his garden. If only he had one of those 3-gallon buckets right about now. Even a cup would help. Maybe he could bring one from the dining room. In the meantime, he really didn't mind using his hands, walking back and forth between the creek and his garden. Luke felt a strange surge of emotion, one that he hadn't felt in so long he'd practically forgotten what it was. Happy, he thought in amazement. I'm happy. Chapter 15. The very next day, Luke raced out to the garden even more eagerly than ever. It was too soon to tell anything about the potatoes, but if the beans still looked good, he could probably be sure that they would live and grow and produce. And would the raspberries have any more buds today? Luke reached his clearing and he stopped short. His garden was destroyed. The raspberry branches were broken off at odd angles. The bean plants were trampled, smashed flat in the mud. There hadn't been any potato shoots to be ruined, of course, but the garden was so messed up, Luke couldn't even tell where he'd planted them. No, Luke wailed, it can't be! He wanted to believe that he'd accidentally walked into the wrong clearing. But that was crazy. There was the maple tree with the jagged cut in its trunk on the side of the clearing, the oak with the sagging limb on the other side, and the rotting trunk in the middle. This was his garden, or it had been. Who wrecked it? His first thought was animals. Back home, when his family still raised hogs, there had been a couple times when the hogs had escaped and they found their way into the garden. They rooted around like crazy, and Mother had been furious over that damage. But there weren't any hogs in the woods. Luke hadn't seen anything bigger than a squirrel, and for all his shooings and worryings, he knew that squirrels could not have caused this kind of damage. And squirrels didn't wear shoes. Luke winced. He'd been too distraught to notice before. Instead of animal tracks, the garden was covered with imprints of the same kind of shoes Luke was wearing. Smooth-soled, barren shoes had stomped his raspberries. They'd trampled his beans, they'd kicked his potato hills, and they'd walked all over his garden. For a crazy instant, Luke wondered if he himself was to blame. Had he been careless enough, leaving the garden yesterday? Could he have stepped on his own plants by mistake? No, that was ridiculous. He'd never do such a thing. What if he sleepwalked and came out here in the night without even knowing it? That was even more preposterous. He would have been caught. And he didn't wear shoes to bed. Anyhow, he could tell by stepping next to the other footprints, some of the imprints were made by shoes that were bigger than Luke's, and some of the imprints were made with shoes that were smaller. Lots of people had been in Luke's garden. Lots of people had been destroying it. Luke sank to the ground by the tree trunk. He buried his face in his hands. This was all I had, he moaned. Once again, he pretended to talk to someone who wasn't there. But it wasn't Mother or Dad or Jen or Mr. Talbot he appealed to now. It was Matthew and Mark, his older brothers. He had to apologize to them. He had to explain why he, Luke Garner, a 12-year-old boy, was crying. Chapter 16. Oh, I can't imagine how Luke felt after going out there, doing all that work on his garden and going out there and finding it destroyed. I would be pretty distraught too if that happened to my garden. I've got it all tilled and ready to go, but I wanted to show you some plants. I'm going to take you over here for a minute before we leave tonight. I've got some little plants growing, and actually these were a gift. Logan gave these to me at Christmas time, and I wanted to show you these plants. I don't know if you can see this. There we go. These little plants have sprouted, and show you the other one. These little plants have sprouted. I don't know if you can see them. There we go. These little plants are sprouting, and I'm pretty excited about that. All right, so boys and girls, it was great to do Read Aloud with you tonight. I will see you on Monday. Bye.